Well, good day to you and welcome to our ongoing study through the Gospel of John. We are in chapter 7 today, and I want to read with you a very interesting portion of Scripture on knowing the will of God. And if you'll pick up with me at John 7, beginning at verse 14, it says, "About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and he began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, 'How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?'" In other words, Jesus was teaching with such great effectiveness and with such great authority and with such great truthfulness that it was difficult to understand where he got this learning because he had never been to rabbi school, so to speak. Well, Jesus answers them, where did he get this learning? And so Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me." In other words, Jesus was not condemning education. He was not condemning learning. He simply was saying that I teach the wisdom I do. The learning I have is from my Father in heaven. It is not my own. And Jesus said these words, and this is very important. He says, and this is going to be the focal point of our teaching today. He said, "If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority." In other words, he's saying, if it is your will to do the will of God, then you will have knowledge. You will have revelation from God. You will understand. He goes on to say, the one who speaks on his own authority only seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true. He's talking about himself. And in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? In other words, he's saying, it's not your will to do the will of the Father, or else you would obey Moses. But because your will is wrong, your will is not after the things of God, that you don't will the things of God, that you're going to misinterpret the scriptures. He says, you even seek to kill me. The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" And Jesus answered them, "I did one work." In other words, he did one miracle. And he says, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but it's from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry at me, because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. In other words, he was saying, you are misjudging me. You are misjudging me because your motives are impure. Your will is to kill me. Your will is not to seek the Father's will. And so this is a portion of Scripture that talks about how do we receive revelation? How do we know the truth of God? Well, it's really spelled out right here in chapter 7, verses 16 and 17. Jesus says these words, "My teaching is not my own, but his who sent me." Now listen to this. If anyone's will is to do God's will. Did you hear that? Jesus said, if it is your will to do God's will, that you will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. Jesus said to the Jewish leaders there, your problem is that you don't want to do the will of God. You've got your religious ceremonies all set up, and you don't want anybody to mess with that. You don't want anyone to tip the card over, that you're not really interested in the will of God. And we find that in life so often, that people will misinterpret Scripture simply because they do not want to know the truth. We are living in a day and age where people don't like some of the the moral teachings of the Scripture. And so, because they don't want to know God's will, they will compromise and they will come up with some way to make the Scriptures say what they want them to say. But listen to it again in verse 17. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know. In other words, we sometimes think that we learn and we know the things of God as we study. But what Jesus is saying here, the key to knowing God, the key to knowing God's will, the key to receiving greater truth from God and greater revelation is that I will to do God's will. So, in other words, it is so important in knowing the truth that our will is in the right direction. Because if you only will to be right, if you only will to want God to agree with you, you will not hear God correctly. I can tell you for many years, I've heard people say it's God's will for me to do such and such. It's God's will for me to marry that person. And they don't really will to do God's will. They will to do their own will. And people often make great mistakes in understanding the will of God because they don't will what God wills. They will what they want. And it is a very dangerous place. And Jesus goes on to say in verse 18, the one who speaks on his own authority, in other words, Jesus just said that I only speak what the Father has taught me. He says, but the one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory. But the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. In other words, when someone speaks only out of their own authority, out of their own will, because they don't want to do the will of God, they're not going to know what the will of God is because they only want their own glory. And it's a big problem. In fact, one of the biggest problems in the human race is that we want our own glory. As long as we want our own glory, we will do our own will. We will seek after our own glory. We will speak out of our own authority rather than God's authority. And Jesus is saying two things here. He says, if you want to know God, you must will his will. Your will must line up with him. If our will does not line up with him, we receive no revelation. Why should God lead us deeper if our real will is simply my own glory or my own way? And so Jesus said you can always tell who the false teacher is because he's looking for his own glory. And so I want to encourage you, when Jesus confronted the religious leaders of his day, he said, you are judging wrongly because it is not your will to do the will of the Father. You want your own glory. And so you teach out of your own authority. But I want to encourage you, brothers and sisters, if you want to know God better, your will has to want his will in your life. If you don't want that, you don't go any further. That so many people want their own way so badly that they will distort the will of God to line up with their own will. And I want to encourage you, brothers and sisters, don't do that. That we need to be people that will to do God's will. Then you will know God. Then you will receive revelation. God bless you.